Thank you, and welcome everybody to what is the third in our series of lectures celebrating 125 years of geography here at Manchester University. Welcome to you all, and a special welcome to Professor Yeung from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's Deputy Head of Human Geography and Regional Development at the Institute for Geographical Sciences and Natural Resources at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and it's his first time in Manchester. And he'll also join us and today's speaker for a PhD masterclass after this lecture at 4 o'clock back at our place. So welcome Wai-chung and welcome everybody. And it's a huge pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Wai-chung Yeung from the National University of Singapore. This sounds far away, but Henry has a strong and an ongoing and lasting connection with Manchester. Actually, exactly 25 years ago, he first hit the ground here at Manchester Airport and then showed up at Peter's office to start his PhD with Peter Dicken, whom I'm also welcoming here. I'm glad he can join us. So Henry goes back 25 years with geography at Manchester, finished his PhD in 1995, before returning to Singapore, and where he took up a lectureship in 1996, subsequently promoted to associate professor in 2000, and then full professor in 2005. I've known Henry since 2000, when I first met him at NUS in Singapore, where he co-organized the first Global Economic Geography Conference. And since then we've been collaborating mostly on a research project led by Peter Dicken on global production networks and regional development. So we've collaborated on that together with colleagues here from Manchester, including Neil Coe, who was here at the time, Jennifer Johns, and Jeff Henderson, what has become known as the Manchester School of Global Production Networks. So there's another connection that's ongoing with Singapore. Today, Henry holds the Provost's Chair and is Professor of Economic Geography at the National University of Singapore. And he's a prolific writer. He's published nearly 100 peer-reviewed journal articles on globalization, transnational corporations, developmental state, strategic coupling, and East Asia more broadly speaking. He's written 4 books, authored books, plus 7 more edited books. So really prolific scholar, widely cited more than 14,000 times, and one of the leading scholars in economic geography worldwide. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome him back at Manchester, and over the next 50 minutes or so, he'll talk about rethinking East Asia in the new global economy, based on his book that came out last year with Cornell University Press, Strategic Coupling. So Henry, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, thank you so much, Martin, for your very generous introduction, and to many of you for turning up in this wonderful Manchester weather. I wish to bring you some Singapore sunshine, but it didn't quite work today, but we'll see tomorrow, all right? It's my great privilege to be here to give a talk, which happened to be this Geography at Manchester 125 years anniversary lecture. As Martin said, 25 years ago, I first stepped in then what's called the Moberly Hall, 13th floor. I stay on the 13th floor, overseeing the Pennines. All right, and when there was earthquake, it shakes a little bit. All right, so it is quite an experience. And of course, it's particularly privileged to have my supervisor, who's the legendary Peter Dicken, who is able to come here to join me in a reverse role, right? I would have then listened to his lectures on globalization, and now I have the opportunity to deliver something that hopefully benefits some of you. I can't wish all of you, just hopefully some of you will find this stuff a little bit useful. But coming back is great. This is where I came from, so it's great to be back to my alma mater. So that's all, and hopefully one day you'll be doing the same. Many of you in particular. Okay, with all that in mind, now I shall run you through just about, I don't know how many 100 slides here, but essentially to give you a quick run of what East Asia has been undergoing in the past 20, 30 years, roughly that kind of time frame since the 1990s. Based on my book, but on the other hand, of course, I can't talk about the entire book in one lecture, so I'll just focus on a particular part of it. What I'm going to do after a not so brief introduction, which talks about a bit of the rise of East Asian economies, then I will talk a bit about one major explanation. I mean, after all, I'm not here to sell Asia. I'm here to give you, and some of you are from Asia, so I'm here to give you a sense of how we in the social sciences have been trying to explain this phenomenon of the rise of East Asian economies, which is what's generally known as the developmental state theory, thesis whatsoever. So, which is kind of outside geography, primarily in political science, development studies, sociology to a certain extent, and so on, and Asian studies. Then I will sort of give you some sense of how we, particularly, the so-called Manchester School of Global Production Networks, or the Manchester Mafia of Global Production Networks, try to look into this phenomenon of East Asian development, not necessarily from the lenses of the state, but more in terms of how domestic actors in Asia, firms in particular, interact with other firms, other actors at the global level. So the interaction between the national and the global. That's the kind of nexus that I'll focus on a bit more in the second part of the lecture, from states, in other words, developmental states, to, if you like, networks, and how, if you think of Asian economies, Asian development, you can think of it as globalizing Asian development. Now, of course, some of you are more familiar with the background to Asian development, and Manchester is one of the very highly sort of really globalized center of learning. What I see now is actually not very different from what I saw in 1992 when I first stepped in terms of the makeup of graduate. I mean, still a huge proportion of Asians then. So Manchester has always been very, very globalized in that sense. So this just gives you a quick run of East Asian economies from originally, if you think of the 1960s, development through what's generally called as a labor-intensive industrialization. Right? Essentially, taking some of the, Manchester again, if you think of the textile and garment industries that Manchester was at least famous for, right? To eventually relocate due to various reasons to East Asia, right? So in that sense, we saw a significant period of labor-intensive industrialization in textile, certain kind of electronics assembly and so on and so forth. And then from the 1980s onwards, East Asian economies experience more a kind of movement towards what's called high value added activities, move towards more high-tech driven industries, which will be captured more in my story later. And then from 2000 to now, we see a great deal more globalization of those firms and industries from Asia, if you like, to other parts of the world. Now, of course, I'm a geographer. I got to show you a map to qualify as a geographer, but that's about it. That's the only map I have. Which give you a sense of the different waves of industrialization in the event that you may not be entirely sure. I don't know how many of you are geography students, but you may not be entirely sure where is Singapore, where I came from. Can you see Singapore? We say it's a little red dot, it's somewhere here. All right, if you can see that dot, which I doubt you can, Japan, China is gigantic. If you can't see, you need to change your lens. Probably free, right, in Britain, but I'm not sure. So Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. These are the objects of inquiry today. All right. Some of you might be interested in Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, or China. We can talk about it during the Q&A. This map essentially gives you a sense of the different waves of industrialization. Japan first, followed by the Asian newly industrialized economies of South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. Now, the puzzle we are trying to solve here is this: is that these are the economies that were trying to catch up, right, by industrializing. Question is, why is it that they are the latecomers? And yet today means about 10, 20 years, in the past 10, 20 years, we see some of the leading firms from these economies that are very competitive in widely global industries. Electronics, certain textile and garment, certain kinds of consumer products, and so on and so forth. So in the case of South Korea, also in automotives, and so on and so forth. So in other words, they must have done something right. Question is, how do we explain, right? So that's the first puzzle. Second is that many of the East Asian economies have very different domestic political economic systems. Yeah? Some may have very strong role of the state, some may have strong role of the market, like Hong Kong, some will be somewhere in between. Very few will have direct replication of what we expect from some of Anglo-American, more market-driven model of economic development. And those of you from the UK will have a sense of how, if you like, the British market system is like. So, give you a sense of the sort of catching up we are talking about, right? So here we are trying to explain the puzzle, why certain economies can catch up quickly, number one. Number two, why certain actors, firms from those economies can catch up rapidly. Semiconductors, South Korea and Taiwan have been very successful in catching up in semiconductor industry. Later I will explain a bit what semiconductors are about, I mean, in the event that some of you may be less familiar. Second is telecommunication equipment, so your mobile phone kind of stuff, or notebooks, the kind of more portable computer or electronic devices. Automotive, and you have South Korea caught up successfully in Hyundai and so on and so forth. And of course, Rory is here, so Rory's work on pharmaceutical India, which is a successful case of catching up, although I'm not going to talk too much about it at all today. And then software and some other industries. So today I'm going to focus more on electronics, particularly the first two. So semiconductors and what we call ICT, Information Communications Technology products, broadly conceived. And most of you have those stuff, if you like. So, what sort of leading firms coming out of the newly industrialized economies of South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, and to a certain extent, new waves of China and India? So you have ICT, of course, you have marine and shipping, means shipbuilding. We just came from Newcastle. So Newcastle is a classic example, used to be, if you like, the world center, if you like, shipbuilding, right? Today, shipbuilding is primarily dominated by South Korea, followed by, actually in volume terms, it's China first, South Korea number two, and then Japan, and so on and so forth. It's all, if you like, primarily in that belt. Transportation, here we are talking about air transportation. So if you think of leading airlines, apart from the Middle East ones, then very many coming out also of these economies. Telecommunications, biotech, and so on and so forth. But today, I'm going to focus only on the ICT proportion. Even in my book, I have some of the chapters on maritime and shipbuilding, transportation, and communications, yeah, means services. Okay, so the key debate is this, right? How to explain? I mean, we know these economies have done quite well since the 1980s. Question is why? Well, there has been very sustained and long period of research on this phenomenon. All right, so it's not that nothing has been done. A lot has been done. Hundreds of books have been written, all right, to explain this phenomenon. What's called, broadly speaking, developmental state literature, in which is argued that there are specific state initiatives that push certain designated firms through specific financial incentives and other incentives, even political decisions, to push them to do certain, to go into certain industries that eventually succeed. There are failure cases also. All right, but by and large, it's argued that through those kind of state-led initiatives, generally known as industrial policy, these Asian economies are able to develop some of those, if you like, world competitive industries as of today. However, I would like to argue that while that argument and actually a lot of evidence provided has been correct, all right, for a long period of time, at least in the 1960s, if you look back looking at 60s, 70s, and the 80s, I would say it's clear to me. But by the 1990s, if you look at events, happenings from the 1990s onwards, it's fair to say the state had lost some of its power due to a few reasons, and I will talk a bit later. But also because the global economy has been changing quite substantially from the 1990s onwards, the time when, of course, Professor Dickon wrote in his Global Shifts. I hope many of you have read all 7 editions from 1986 when I first read that edition as a student in Singapore. That's how I came to Manchester. Without that book, I wouldn't be here, literally. 25 years ago, then 25 years later, you know. So, moral of the story is, times have changed. Something happened at the global level, right? And hence, these domestic national champions have been able to sort of connect. And in my work, I talked about strategic coupling. So in other words, these actors, national champions, have been able to connect successfully, coupled with global production network initiatives, activities. In so doing, have access to technology, knowledge, market, and so on and so forth that enable them to develop even further. So this is in that sense that I think there is a new mechanism of economic development known as, if you like, domestic global nexus. And this, I use the term strategic coupling to kind of describe it, so to speak. So in other words, strategic coupling with global production networks provide one not the only, but one mechanism of economic development. Because we used to think that state driver would be one mechanism. Today, I will argue strategic coupling can provide another mechanism. Now, question is, what are global production networks or global value chains? As some of you may know, but others may be less familiar. So those GPN, GVC experts here, it's time for you to take a nap. All right, I'm going to give you a quick sense of what this stuff is about. All right. Okay, first, when I say strategically coupled with GPN, then at least you got to know what are GPNs by and large. GPNs are very significant today. Why? Because some 80% of world trade passes through some kind of GPN relationships. All right. Now, it used to be about half of world trade goes through what we call subsidiaries of multinational firms, right? Intra-firm trade, we call trade among subsidiaries of transnational corporations. However, today, these same TNCs, together with their suppliers, partners, and what have you, their total trade is worth about 80%. So it means only 20% of world trade is kind of not through this kind of inter-firm relationships, put it that way. To the extent that the World Bank now argues that GPNs and GVCs are the world economy's backbone and central nerve system. So whether you like it or not, in your body, I hope you have a backbone. I hope you have a central nerve system. And as you know, if one of them goes wrong, it can be pretty bad, right? So the moral of the story is, whatever your shape, look, whatsoever, behavior, you've got to have that backbone and central nerve system. And we argue that this GPN stuff and GVC is that, all right? You can't see it, but it's there. And we need to understand it. Now, of course, for today's purpose, I have quite a bit of empirical data. I may not go through all of them in great detail, all right? If you're interested, you can read the stuff or the book or whatsoever. I won't go through the numbers, but I just want to show you the size, all right? If you look at the size, the big pie charts, all right? This is about 2008 data, 10 years ago. If you look at the, what is this color called? Gold, or I don't know, gold, yellow. This bar, this pie refers to what we call trade in intermediate goods. So intermediate goods are not the finished good like your phone or your computer, but the stuff that go into the phone. So the stuff that go in that needs to be put together into your phone, into your computer, into this monitor, into the car, into your clothes, and so on and so forth. So we call trade in intermediate goods. Now, if countries trade more with each other through these firms in intermediate goods, means production networks become very extensive, right? Things that eventually get put together tend to be traded among different countries in order to be put together. I will give you a very specific example later on. Smartphone and notebook production, for example. Now, the point is, if you look at the entire 2000s, all right, to 2009 and 10, the growth of trade in intermediate goods is gigantic. In other words, there is a great deal more of globalization of production networks, by and large. This is just to give you an impression, all right? You can question the specific numbers, but this just gives you a sense. The pie chart for each shows the percentage of trade that tends to be within the region. All right, so you can tell in Asia, 64% trade within Asia, intermediate goods, 71% in Europe, which makes sense. European countries, maybe with or without the exception of Britain, this is a tricky moment, tends to be within Europe. Trading means the firms in Europe have trade relationships with different locations in order to end up finishing a good for sales within Europe, for example. America is a bit smaller for obvious reasons, because they always like to do it by themselves. Yeah? Okay, so let me move on to the main bulk of the lecture. First, this is to revisit the idea of the developmental state thesis. Now, some of you, again, if you have learned this before, again, you can take a brief nap, but essentially I need to give you a sense of how we used to explain this. We used to explain by this particular, I've summarized it this way in a figure. We used to have a state. We think of the state, a state is a political entity, if you like, with a combination of the government, the party, but also other organs of the state. And the state is argued that, according to some of these very, very famous authors in political science, development studies, and so on, will have a certain autonomy from society, civil society organizations, so that the state could do what it wants to do, and so on. Because of that, it has the power to impose or develop certain kind of industrial sectors. So that kind of makes sense, right? To develop or push through certain industries, you've got to have power, so to speak. You've got to be what Peter Evans used to call, you've got to be autonomous from societal influences. You've got to have a certain bureaucratic rationality, means you've got to know what you're doing, so to speak. You've got to have the agency, an agency that's called pilot agency, an agency that has the kind of institutional power. In South Korea, in Taiwan, in Singapore, there were such agencies that, if you like, were modeled after Japan. So the original example was Japan, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI in short. All right? So you had a state that was autonomous, rational, had agency power, that then developed certain policy intervention, choosing certain industries. So, and in so doing, develop those industries. And of course, the late Alice Samstan argued that this state intentionally get prices wrong. Now, if you're an economist, you know you follow the market, you follow the price signal, then if the price is too high, then you don't go into this industry, right? But in the case of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, or even Japan earlier, it's argued that the state intentionally subsidized firms to go into industries, even though the prices were too high. So in that sense, you get prices wrong. Yeah? You go against the market, so to speak. And through financial subsidy, and of course there are very specific details which I can't go into much of it, because each of them will have different relationship between the state, for example, and the central bank. All right, so Korea, for example, the president then, Park Chung-hee, was able to control the Bank of Korea, and in so doing disperse the loans to Samsung, Hyundai, the sort that you know of today, that enable those firms to go into those industries. Right? And then you end up producing the national champions. But of course, Amsden argued that then the state require performance, means I give you this subsidy, you got to export that number of cars, that number of radios, that kind of stuff. In his time, 60s, up to early 70s. That leads to a certain kind of oligopoly, in the sense only 2 were chosen to go into those industries. South Korea, later on Taiwan, Singapore to a certain extent, and there is a lot of work done, so I'm not going to sort of explain everything. Now, the problem with this approach, now this approach is very well known, very extensive in the literature, which had its historical value, because to me, it did explain very well the initial foundation of some of these, at least these 3 East Asian economies, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. 60s, 70s, at least up to the 80s, I would say. The problem is that it only focused on state capacity. So the state was the only unit, if you like, independent variable that you were looking at. You look at the state as the independent variable that explains the outcome, which is development, which is the dependent variable, right? So you focus on the domestic nature of state-firm relations, and some other political scientists have argued that this tends to be too neo-Weberian, and kind of Peter Evans' work, because it's explicitly Weberian sociology that focuses on bureaucratic rationality, and hence it's argued that this approach tends to be too fetishizing the state as a powerful institution, and hence the term institutional fetishism that he argued. He argued that, well, the state may not have the magical power to drive all national champion, all right? It may appear so, but it's not necessarily so, so to speak. Others have pointed out, not me, but others have pointed out that since the 1980s, there have been changing domestic and international contexts that began to make it difficult or reduce the capacity of the state. Not to say eliminate the state, but reduce the capacity. And I think in the masterclass later, I've given you one of my articles that we'll discuss for some of you, much more detail of that decline in capacity stuff. But by and large, for today's purpose, I will just briefly run through 3. One is that since the late 1980s, we have a great deal more neoliberalization of the world economy. Finance became much more powerful in particularly world capital markets, London, New York, and hence so on and so forth. That make it very hard for the national state to pursue this kind of selective industrial policy that it would be premised on, if you like, heavy financial interventions, right? Second is that in those economies that used to be very authoritarian, all right, well, it's all men, so it's kind of one-man show thing that was very, very deterministic. And since the 1980s, South Korea, Taiwan, 86, 87, around that kind of time, began to be much more democratized, including election, rise of civil society, and so on and so forth, that make it much harder to have the kind of coherent state that earlier I was talking about in terms of embedded autonomy. So there was a lot more patron-client relationship when election came, so it became factionalized, and hence it's very hard to think of a state knowing what it's doing and then determine what kind of industries to go in. A lot more competing interests from the late 1980s onwards. Third is that the world also has been changing. Why? Berlin Wall was down. So before the Berlin Wall was down, the US was very happy to see South Korea and Taiwan growing rapidly because they were meant to be blocking communist spread in Asia, right? Particularly from China's side, so to speak. And then North Korea, right? Which, as you know, today, that part of the story is still unfolding, yeah? So with if you like, the end of the Cold War, and hence geopolitical changes, that the US was less happy to provide what's called the unfettered market. Basically, try everything to allow South Korea and Taiwan, and then Singapore to a certain extent, to export without any constraint. In other words, South Korea, Taiwan, even Singapore were kind of really using subsidy to promote its own exports to America. So in other words, if you think of Donald Trump today, no way, right? He's giving you a big hustle because he thinks America first, right? Then it's not America first, but it's to say America is not going to be as generous because we don't need to be so worried about communism because the Cold War has ended. See what I'm saying? So that geopolitical story is a very important story. It's not so well recognized in the literature, but some geographers, for example, Jim Glassman and I think Jamie, you guys work, and some, of course, selective policy scientists have shown that part of the story being a very important story that tends to be overlooked. But I won't be able to go into great details. So state capacity role have been transformed to a certain extent, weakened in this sense. All right? It does other things, but it's not in industrial policy terms. So we are discussing the article in this journal later on in the afternoon, essentially in which I talked about the sort of dismantling or decline of the pilot agency, the agency that was in charge of industrial policy, economic development in all three economies. Actually, in two economies, I should say. In South Korea, environment planning, I said. No, Economic Planning Board, yeah, environment planning. Economic Planning Board, 1993 was dismantled, absorbed into the Ministry of Finance and Economy in 1994, and then the new Industrial Development Law in 1995 basically made it very much harder for the state to directly subsidize certain industries. In Taiwan, the CEPD, the Council for Economic Planning and Development, was again weakened. There are specific politics behind this, which I can't go into detail, just take it as such. And then the Ministry of Finance, again, has been historically not as powerful as Ministry of Finance in South Korea. The Industrial Development Board, again, became weakened within MOEF, Ministry of Economic Affairs. This is Taiwan. And in Singapore, the Economic Development Board and Ministry of Trade Industry remain about the same. So Singapore remains quite developmental at the time when South Korea, Taiwan's state became more weakened, if you like. Second is to say, it's not just state capacity that was kind of weakened, but also the instruments that the state used were also transformed. State used to dictate directly through subsidy specific industries and sectors for firms to go in. From the 1990s or late 80s onwards, there was a shift towards what's called horizontal and functional industrial policy. Now, there is a difference between vertical industrial policy, which is dictating, to horizontal means we try to promote R&D, we try to promote capacity building, we try to make it easier to trade internationally without dictating what industries you go in. So that's called functional or horizontal industrial policy. It's still doing more than what, for example, the state in Britain does in that sense of the word. Yeah? So we still call it horizontal industrial policy in support of domestic firms taking advantage of globalizing opportunities, such as promoting industrial upgrading, innovation, facilitating trade and investment. To the extent that one scholar in South Korea argued that since the 1980s, the large conglomerates emerged as independent interest groups. They didn't want to listen to the state telling them what to do. They want to, in fact, intervene in politics as well, right? So the chaebol's interests dominate the public discourses and government policies because these very national firms, by the 1990s, have acquired capital, technology, market access. It's almost like the children who have grown up refuse to listen to parents like you guys, right? Do you listen to your parents as much as when you were 10 years younger? Because at that time, your parent could tell you what to do because you need to get your allowance. Today, no, right? Do you? I hope you do, because I'm a family guy, so I hope you do listen to your parents, but I doubt you do. You guys are university kids now, right? Okay, so that gives you a sense of happening, changes, that make it harder for the state to be as developmental as it used to be. Now, let me move on quickly to then the newer time period from the 1990s onwards, right? So since I've painted the picture that state used to be strong, managed to develop certain industries and firms, but over time, capacity was reduced, broader global changes make it harder for the state to push. So what? Then what happened? Now, what happened will be then that then these same firms and new domestic firms that emerge connect with opportunities available in the global arena. It's almost like, again, you come here, you get into a university, you meet new people, you meet friends. And it's this kind of networks that you develop here that may shape your career development in future, may shape your life trajectories. And I mean it. Look at me. 25 years ago, I was here, right? So it's in that sense that the kind of growing up, the new coupling, well, literally in your case is coupling, all right? Coupling with somebody, you know, so that's the word coupling, that need to new development. And that's in personal terms. But in terms of the whole economy, we think of leading firms coupling with new players elsewhere. And that requires a new thinking. And that new thinking can be encapsulated in this idea of global production networks as one new platform for domestic firms. And hence there is a structural, there is a shift from a kind of structural dependence of firms on domestic state to domestic firms strategically coupled with global production networks. So there is a strategic disembedding of the firms from state apparatus, and then this same firm re-embed with lead firms in global production networks, and then there is this shifting partnership. And in my book, I've sort of captured this in this figure by saying that if you look at the 1950s to 80s, you have strong developmental state in East Asia, and national firms were embedded in these strong state initiatives. But if you look at the late 1980s to now, the state had lost some of its power and became more, if you like, post-developmental state, and national firms became disembedded from state control and initiatives and connect themselves with lead firms from this part of the world, all right, from Europe, from North America. And during the same time period, you also went through a kind of transition from what's called welfare state to more neoliberal regulatory state, right? So these were the broader political economic restructuring or transformations at very sort of major macro level, and how firms sort of emerge from a kind of national firms to become lead firms in global production networks. So this conceptually give you that sense of relationships. What I'm going to do subsequently is to give you specific examples and to show you how it actually works in particularly electronics and information and communication technologies, all right? And the stuff that you will know the firms, all right, once I start talking about Apple and so on and so forth. Okay, a bit more theory before I go into the real empirics. First is to say, by coupling with global production networks, Asian firms have an opportunity to access to new sources of knowledge, power, capability beyond what their home states. Again, it's just like your own experience, right? Meeting new friends give you new horizons, sometimes bad influences, of course, but then on the other hand, give you some new senses that your parents may not be able to give you, or your own family, so to speak. So strategic coupling refers to the articulation of domestic firms and economies into the competitive dynamics of global industries. So what are the lead firms from global production network? These are the firms that, if you like, can define products and markets, as we will call them. Now, lead firms in our book with Nilko, your former head of geography here, who is now my boss, and we wrote this Global Production Network Theory book, 2015, that we specify lead firms as the one that control and coordinate production networks. So if you think of the firms you know of, they are the leading brand name firms, tends to be the lead firm. And they control the particular network that they engage in. So examples we talked about will be Apple and Samsung, Toyota in automotive industries, in every industry. The top 20 firms in every industry today tend to be the leading players. All right, so in certain kind of industry services, for example, digital technology, you think of Google. In e-commerce, you think of Amazon. In, of course, manufacturing, you think of Apple, Samsung, Toyota, and what have you. All right, and there are other players which connect with this guy. So Intel, for example, you heard of Intel, do you? Intel Inside, that's the brand, right? But Intel is not a lead firm because Intel, it produces chips, but the chips that you can't eat, right? So the chips that got to go into something, whatever it is, whether it's a computer or it's a notebook or into a military equipment, it has to go into something. That something becomes the thing that is final. So Intel only produces what we call intermediate goods. It's not a finished good producer, so to speak. All right? But of course, the chip maker that makes the chip that you eat is different. Yeah? That's the food company that makes chips that you eat. And that is a finished good. You get a difference. It's like Apple, the company, and Apple, the fruit. All right? Okay, so how do Asian firms couple with these kind of lead firms, right? The Apple, the Samsung, the Toyotas, the what have you all, okay, the General Motors and so on. There were favorable conditions from the 1990s onwards. First is to say, some of the East Asian economies I'm examining had a bunch of people. These people who kind of went abroad to study, like some of you here, but now it's much later. All right, in the 60s, 70s, some of the Koreans, Taiwanese, Singaporeans went particularly to America. Singaporeans came to Britain, all right, because of the colonial links and so on. And many of these people came back, brought with them the connections, right? Work with and in those leading firms in Silicon Valley, came back to Asia. So they embody the links, the connections. One, and that's very important. And Saxenian called this the new ergonoids, people who fly between the two places, so to speak. Second is that in those industries, again, electronics I'm looking at, you can look at automotive, look at many industry, there is a great deal of what we call vertical specialization. In other words, there is increasing breaking down of the production process and value chain in such a way that each firm specializes in certain parts, because no firm can and would like to do the whole thing. You can't. Products become too sophisticated, technology moves so fast, you can't do everything by yourself. You have to focus on certain parts. And hence, the parts that you don't do, somebody can take over and have an opportunity to do it. Third is that the domestic state work very hard to develop R&D facilities and infrastructure and human resources in terms of investment in universities and R&D and what have you. So in that sense, these were the favorable conditions that enable strategic coupling of East Asian firms with lead firms in the global economy. In my book, I talked about 3 component mechanisms of strategic coupling. Strategic partnership, so East Asian firms partner with lead firms in global production network, 1. 2, East Asian firms try to be specialists. So not partnership, but be a specialist, do something and be the best in the world in doing that something. Because if you can specialize in that something, in what I call industrial market specialization, means you make certain things for other industries, for other players in the same industry. So in semiconductor, this is a classic example, as well as in shipbuilding and so on and so forth. Third, some East Asian firms emerge to be the global lead firms themselves. The Samsung example, the Hyundai example, and so on. But for today's purpose, I won't talk about that. I will only talk about strategic partnership and industrial market specialization. I will skip this. Essentially, this summarizes what I've been talking about. Okay, so I will focus on the electronics and semiconductor industry by and large. So these East Asian firms, to couple, they have favorable condition, but they also had to do something, right? So what did they have to do? What they did was to innovate organizationally, not just technology, but to do things differently. Some pursue lower cost approaches. You typical thing, oh, outsource to East Asian firms because they are cheap. Yes, that's one possibility. Another possibility is that they upscale. They do things at such large scale that you can't do. Because you can't do now, you have to let them do the job. Because they can print 5,000 books in one go, whereby you manually copy one manuscript. Just think of the difference, right? So some of these firms upscale, if you like. Others upgrade their technologies, develop new product and process technologies to be able to be of value to you, the lead firm. Finally, customization. Some of these East Asian firms try to customize the products and services for you so that then you can do what you're best at. For example, marketing, post-sale services, that you tend to be very good in those things. So they tend to co-evolve, co-develop. And this works in different industries in the electronics segment. Okay, let me move into what's called the electronics industry with some facts and figures, all right? Now, I will move a bit faster here because many are just sort of visual things, all right? But here, just to set the parameters. First, think of the ICT industry. It's very significant. It's not an insignificant industry, all right? Again, coming to Britain, one may have thought financial industry is the big deal, right? Well, finance is important, but the world is not just made out of finance, all right? Now, if you think in 1988, this is ICT hardware, just hardware, no software yet, all right? In terms of world merchandise exports, about 11% of the world's merchandise export belongs to the ICT industry. It's very significant, all right? 11%. But by 2014, this increased to 16%, all right? And the trade in intermediate goods, about half. So 16% of the world trade belongs to ICT industry hardware. Out of that, half will be trade in stuff that go into the hardware, intermediate goods, roughly, yeah? One. Okay, skip this because I'm going to talk about some of these locations. Second is to look at South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore in terms of what we call share of world total, but this is about 10 years old data, in terms of trade in intermediate goods, world trade in intermediate manufactured goods. It's about a few percent. Together, the three of them, small economies, 10%. 10%, they are in charge of 10% of the goods and components that go into the making of all electronics products in the world. Not small, quite significant, all right? And of course, China is coming up. Another figure, more recent, by up to 2014, which shows you what is called the importers, the world's biggest importers of intermediate ICT goods. Means countries that import components and parts and modules that go into the final assembly of something, yeah? China is biggest. Understandable, isn't it? China is the world factory. Of course, it has to import a lot of intermediate goods. No problem. Number two, Hong Kong. Now, that's very weird because Hong Kong is a small place. You don't need that many chips, all right? Number three is the United States. Makes sense? Possible. Number four is Singapore, Korea. So essentially, if you look at it, Taiwan is not here because of these United Nations numbers. United Nations cannot recognize Taiwan for diplomatic reasons. So they group it under other Asia. Very smartly. Other Asia means Taiwan, essentially, okay? So Singapore, Korea, and whatever that means, right? So these three are my object of inquiry, isn't it? So they are here, all right? It's not small. The Hong Kong part actually belongs to China, actually, but it's due to custom data. Okay, now you have a sense of the big players in terms of importing intermediate goods, because then you need to make something, right? Now let's look at exporters. Who export this stuff? Intermediate goods in ICT. The big ones, China, makes sense. China import a lot, but also export a lot, all right? Korea, next, because Korea make a lot of chips, right? Computer chips, makes sense. Japan, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. So at least you get a feel, right, in terms of the key players. Who import a lot? China again, followed by Hong Kong. Hong Kong is weird because Hong Kong doesn't need that many intermediate goods, so it goes to China, essentially. So almost like 45% of world's import of intermediate goods go into China, essentially. If you do the number, this is about 300, 200, so it's almost $500 billion in 2014 went into China, and China export 360. So in other words, China had a net inflow of intermediate goods that go into the production of whatsoever, stuff that need electronics, so to speak. What about final goods? Means finished. Your iPhone, if you like, your computer, notebook, all assembled in China, and that's called finished when the moment is shipped out. China export 580 billion, makes sense. United States next is, so the moment you come, after China, everybody is small, put it that way. Means everything is assembled, almost, large variety in China. Vietnam is more, because you will know the story later, of Samsung. Now, interestingly, who import a lot? And we know very well this is the Donald Trump problem, isn't it? So America import a lot of the finished good. Hong Kong is the weird one because Hong Kong doesn't need $115 billion worth of electronics goods, all right? Divided by a population of 6 million, everybody get hundreds of thousands of dollars of iPhone. I don't know, maybe Hong Kong, everybody has 1,000 iPhones or what have you. It's crazy. So this is clearly China. Together with China, so you see, China is 115 and 78 is about 200 billion. China import about $200 billion worth of finished electronics goods. But export, 580. See the difference? 400 bill, yeah? Roughly. This is just give you a sense. Okay, you have a sense of who does what in aggregate national sense. Now let's look at the importance of the industry to the three economies I'm studying. Yeah? South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. In 1991, electronics industry as a percentage of total manufacturing is about 10% in South Korea. 10% of South Korea's manufacturing in 1991 was electronics. Okay, quite significant, but no big deal. 20 years down the road, it became 1/4. Now, South Korea doesn't just do electronics, it makes cars too, it makes other things. So this is quite big, 1/4. In the case of Taiwan, from 13-14% to almost 44%. So almost half of Taiwan's manufacturing is in the electronics industry. It's a big deal. Singapore has always been a big deal, 40+%. All right, so this is not a small industry in the world as a whole, as well as in the three economies I'm looking at. I know you guys are the consumers of this stuff, but I need to tell you who make what and where, right? Okay, so this typically gives you a sense of, in the mid-1990s, who were the players in this kind of global production networks. Now, lead firms from America, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, HP, Dell, Seagate, all right? So they were the lead firms. Then the Japanese, some of these brands supply some of the components. And then South Korean, Samsung, Hyundai supply the memory chips. And then Taiwan, these guys make some of the components, and Singapore, and then it's assembled in China, by and large. All right. This figure gives you a sense of smartphone in 2010 and 2015. All right. We just look at two examples, Samsung and Apple. All right. If you look at Samsung in 2010, it has 3%, 4% of world market share. Apple, iPhone, 12%. All right. But by 2015, Samsung is 23% of world's market share in smartphone. Apple is 16%. So in other words, in 4 years, Samsung became the world's leading player in smartphone production. In terms of who make what, Samsung makes everything by itself. Apple, 70% gave it to Foxconn to assemble, 25% gave it to Pegatron in 2015. For notebook computers, same. All right. By 2015, we just look at 2015 data. Lenovo, HP, Dell, Apple, these are the four biggest brands, roughly. 20% Lenovo, 20% HP, but roughly there, and 12% Dell, 10% Apple. This is world's total notebooks. Yeah. Who makes what? Again, Lenovo, half made by Taiwanese guys. These are the Taiwanese guys, Quanta, Compare, and Vistrom. Half made by itself. HP, only in-house production 2%. Everything else, give it to the Taiwanese. Dell, 0. Dell makes 0 of its notebooks. Any Dell is made by the Taiwanese. Apple, as you know, has no manufacturing. Again, everything give it to the Taiwanese. That then made it in China. This just gives you the impression. Okay, and this essentially tells you the same story with further breakdown of details. So who are these Taiwanese guys, right? You may wonder. This is the strategic partnership I'm talking about. Pegatron, Foxconn, you know, many of you. Foxconn in 2013 is 136. Today is about 150 billion. This is a 150 billion company. But the other guys make computers, Quanta, Compal, Vistrom. These are roughly about 25 to $30 billion company. They assemble 97-98% of the world's notebooks. All notebook computers will be assembled, actually rephrased, will be designed and assembled by these guys. That's why they are called ODM, original design manufacturer. This is how it looks like. Your typical Apple, I'm an Apple user, so I'm very familiar with Apple's global production networks. So this is your laptop, and so these are the lead firm brands, and these are the Taiwanese that assemble, design and assemble for the lead firms, and then they buy the components from these guys, Intel, AMD chips, Micron will be memory, or Toshiba, or Samsung, that goes into solid state drive, the stuff that go into your computer. And then they ship it to China, Chongqing currently, or Chengdu in the case of Dell, and assemble there, and then depending on where you buy it, you get it from wherever you buy it. That roughly gives you a sense of where your notebook comes from, who makes what. Yeah? Now, what's the difference between these two phones? Now, who has Samsung? I think iPhone more people. Samsung, raise your hand, proudly, or not so proudly. It's less, right? The rest, I presume, iPhone user. I'm Apple user, so you better be an iPhone user. Anything else, don't tell me. I don't want to know, all right? So, now this is a classic example. What is the relationship between these two, all right? Apple on the right and Samsung on the left. So this is the Galaxy S8 and iPhone i7. Now, the late Steve Jobs used to rephrase. Obama used to ask the late Steve Jobs, right, in 2011, I think, or 11, yeah, that what would it take to make iPhones in the United States. Of course, today, if you change this face to Obama, then Steve Jobs then did say that those Jobs said Jobs ain't coming back. All right. Today, if it's Trump asking him, then he will say, "Come to my grave, I will tell you." So this will give you some sense of why iPhone cannot be made in America. All right, because the entire production network is in Asia. All right, it's the design. I mean, you go to the back of your phone. It's designed in California, yes, but it cannot be made in California or anywhere in America. It's very difficult because the many components that you break it down tend to be produced in Asia, need not be owned by Asian firms. All right. So, for example, the A chip in your iPhone is called A chip, application processor chip. Currently, it's the 10th generation A10. Has been made by Samsung for 8 generations. A1 to A8 have been made by Samsung. I'll give you another example. This is a breakdown of Apple iPhone 4. All right, the factory price is about $200. It's consistently the same. The new latest iPhone 8 is about $200 worth in terms of the costing. Yeah, and I'll move a bit quicker. But in terms of the value generated, about $25 from the US, and that's the design. R&D costs, all right? But Korea produced some $80 out of the $200 worth, 40%. 40% of an iPhone came from essentially Samsung. Samsung make the 40%, all right? Ranging from the display to the memory to the processor, all right? But Samsung makes every of its phone by itself. So that's the moral of the story, the new iPhone 7, and this will be, how do we know all this, by the way, you may wonder, isn't it? We just break the bloody phone. How to study? You break your car. No, don't. You break your phone, all right? And just check every single component like this. Actually, to be fair, just go to this ifixit.com. They do it for you. You don't have to worry, all right? And at Global Production Network Center of NUS, Neil and I, we actually have some money, so we bought data, the data you saw earlier. So we know exactly which part made by who, and so on and so forth. For example, this is a Taiwanese company, Catcher, that make the casing, the aluminum magnesium casing that your Apple computers, all the Macs, and that one is worth more than $100. And that's the most expensive component. I show you just the component, but I won't explain, all right? So these are the various components, A10 chip, and all the chips that go into the current iPhone 7 or 8. And we know exactly who make it, and so on. And if we do the research, I will skip this part, then we'll be able to tell where. Now, so you have a sense of now the complexity of this stuff, right? The final good you're using. But the components, the intermediate goods that go in. Question is, who make what? Okay, the Taiwanese firms, particularly Foxconn. I know some of you coming in with Jamie's class is coming in for Foxconn, all right? Now, here's Foxconn. Foxconn hired loads of people, 500,000 in Shenzhen and Zhengzhou. Currently, these are the two key locations where Foxconn assembled the iPhone and gave very little value, about $5 US of your $200 production cost go into Foxconn's assembly of the phone. The components come from all kinds of players, including Samsung, as I told you. This one skip, my book was plagiarized by Forbes, so in this example. Okay, so that's one example that gives you this idea of the smiling curve, right? That Foxconn is at lower end, Hon Hai, and Apple is at the high end, but both sides, and the value capture is a lot more by Apple, yes, but also a lot by Hon Hai. So Foxconn has been always profitable, never lost money, even though they only earn $5 from assembling the phone. Why? Because as some of you know, they, of course, repress the workers. Now, another story which we can go into great details later, but just give you a sense of how all of these different players get involved in this activity and what we call strategic partnership. So today, Apple cannot do without Foxconn. Apple cannot find anybody else to make that many iPhones within that short time period at all. It has to be done by Foxconn. Only Foxconn has the capacity and industrial experience of assembling this volume. This volume means 100 million, 200 million iPhones. Can you do it? No way, right? Second mechanism briefly, which is industrial market specialization. So you get a sense of how Taiwanese firms work with global lead firms in notebook computers, in smartphones, in producing becoming key players in the world economy. Second, firms like Samsung was able to develop very rapidly to become the world's second largest semiconductor firm in the world now. This year may overtake Intel. Intel has always been number one. All right. So the model I'm trying to show you is that Taiwan has also two firms, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, and UMC, that make many of the chips that go into your products. All right. What are they? Okay, I'm going to skip some of these figures just to show you in terms of the location of TSMC, many fabs in many parts of the world, in Hsinchu, Taichung, and further south, and of course in certain parts of China. And this is Samsung, how Samsung managed to again become a key player in terms of semiconductor manufacturing in some 3 locations. All right, this is what the plants look like in Gyeonggi-do. The Samsung digital city near there, which is this area in South Korea. All right. So some of the key complexes where they make, Samsung essentially make most of the semiconductor products, apart from the factories in Austin, in South Korea, in those regions. All right. And this is the Samsung digital city that designed, and actually it's the mother factory, what they call the mother factory of your Samsung phone. So I will show you briefly how Samsung's production network is organized. Now, in 2013, if you look at Samsung's employment in Southeast Asia, it was only, where is it? It's only here. It's only about 80,000 people, all right? But by 2015, Samsung employed 140,000 people in Southeast Asia, essentially Vietnam. So I will just show you briefly how your S8 phone is assembled. Where? So it's in Vietnam, Samsung Electronics, Vietnam. So Samsung's manufacturing of mobile phone is worth about $40 billion in 2016, just the mobile phone division of Samsung. All right, but it has invested tremendously in Vietnam since 2009. Currently, about 75% of Samsung's mobile phones are assembled in Vietnam. In 2017, Samsung becomes something like more than $50 billion exports out of Vietnam, which is worth 75% of Vietnam's total exports. Samsung is a dominant player in Vietnam now. So, in conclusion, I couldn't go into even more detail about many of these key products that you're using. I use them because they are products that you use. And we have many other examples in many other industries that give you this sense of how domestic firms connect with global lead firms. So Foxconn in Taiwan connect with Apple. Samsung connect with Apple but develop its own as well. Quanta, Vistrom, and others work with leading notebook brand names to become key manufacturers from their respective economies. And in so doing, it gives us a sense of how economic development can occur through the development of some of these domestic firms, which are not necessarily product of the state. Right? Some of these firms completely grew on their own, not driven by state initiatives. And that gives us a new conception, a dynamic one that helps us to understand state-firm relations in a world of globalization. So this is the kind of area that I thought economic development can be understood better. Second is that we need to think of development as beyond the state. The state is always there, it's important. I always say in all my presentations that I'm not saying that the state is not there. All right? The state, by the way, will not wither away. By definition, you cannot have a society, anarchy, unless it's an anarchy system. All right? Otherwise, the state will always be there. But the point is the role of the state in certain kind of industrial and economic development can change over time, can diminish over time. That's the story I'm focusing on today. So in so doing, that helps us to understand why some of these Asian firms are able to take advantage of what we call new windows of opportunities. The sort of opportunities I've told you empirically earlier. It's not just about this state having the capacity, having the strong political backing, but also that there are domestic firms that are able to build firm-specific competencies and dynamics. Finally, just give you a sense of then what sort of policy can we ask for. So the policy that used to be firm-driven means subsidizing particular firm can be problematic. So you cannot just promote specific domestic firm, but you need to build broader industry-level growth dynamics. Second is to focus on the kind of policies that may nudge certain kind of coupling with global production network. So in other words, there's no point Because I do some of this policy talk quite a bit with development agencies or from different countries. They always say, oh, which industry should I plug in? Tell me quickly. I say, no, you can't. All right. What you need to do is to perhaps think of the kind of industry that you may have a certain opportunities and nudge through policy initiatives firms. But by producing either information, perhaps some kind of seed funding, perhaps some kind of outreach in terms of marketing that help your firms. You can't really tell your firms what to do because you cannot. You just don't have the capacity. As Robert Wade argued in his more recent work, that we need a new politics of industry and sectoral choice that go beyond sort of choosing winning firms and industries. Instead, focus on broad-based capabilities in new technologies, product, process innovation, and market development. I don't think I have a page 70, so this is the last page. Thank you. Okay, so maybe I start with the Foxconn one because it's more specific and straightforward. Foxconn's announcement of whatever billion-dollar investment in Wisconsin. I have no privileged information. I bet you have bought some shares, right? That's what we want to know, yeah? So, but as someone who knows this industry, okay, currently I'm doing a lot of, okay, just maybe to put in context, right? Despite what I've written, right now, from March to August this year, I've been doing intensively electronics industries interview. So I've interviewed about done 60 interviews of 48 global lead firms, including many of the same firms I've talked about. So the combined value of my firms is about $750 billion in 2016 revenue and $50 billion profits, including Samsung Electronics. And I'll come back when I answer the Samsung question. The companies I failed to interview pretty high. I mean, it's all vice president, senior vice president level of many of the leading firms you know of. I failed to interview Apple, which refused. Foxconn, refused. And what's the last one? Intel, the naughty ones, all right? But these are almost all the number ones. Apple is number one in particular arena. Intel is in semiconductor, number one, and Foxconn is number one in EMS, electronics manufacturing services. And hence, I don't have interview data to tell you, except to say from my guess, yes, it doesn't make economic sense. Doesn't. It has to be political reason. But then, you see, just because iPhones are assembled in America, because Foxconn is willing to set up factories there to satisfy that man, that crazy man, then American consumers will suffer because the iPhones assembled in America are much more expensive than the ones assembled in China right now. And you means Vodafone is not going to bring you iPhones assembled in America. It's too expensive, right? So they will still buy from China. I mean, not buy from Apple, but assembled in China. So who will suffer? American consumers. They have to pay more to get their iPhone, which is ironic, but never mind. They ask for it. So I hope that answered your question. Basically, I can tell you anybody, I mean, I did presentation in DC and I told the folks in America that you want to move this stuff back to America, you can, but your guys just have to pay a lot more, all right? But that is your problem. You want it, you can have it assembled in America, just at much higher cost. So that deal with that, and then I will answer Khalid and Steph's question together. Maybe I just answer the state GPN model question. Role of the state in this kind of GPN-led development, right? So it's more in terms of what I will call earlier horizontal industrial policy. So for example, the state could try to build R&D capacity, hoping that your domestic firms will have the kind of capability to plug in. Because without that, there is no reason you can plug in successfully. Second is to provide perhaps the broader trade and investment facilitation role, rather than telling specific investment projects what to do kind of thing. There was a missing point which I forgot to talk about earlier in terms of the broader international change that led to the declining role of the state in industrial policy, which is the rise of the WTO. Means with the rise of the WTO, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore cannot directly subsidize domestic firms for exports because that is WTO non-compliant. It's countervailing. Means not fair because you subsidize your own firm, then make the things cheaper and hence more likely to export, right? But WTO doesn't allow this. So in other words, with WTO regulation, even China cannot over-subsidize these firms, right? So that makes it very hard for the developmental state by the early 1990s to do what it used to do. Very hard. You just can't do it. So many of this came out of interviews with government officials, trade officials, and so on. Yeah, they recognize it. So let me move on to Khalid and Steph's question. Essentially, this broader question about the importance of home market, the shift in, if you like, major lead firms that benefit from a large domestic market. Yeah. So and hence Steph adding on by saying that the earlier days we always thought of North America, Western Europe being the end market, so Asia just make for you kind of thing. Today Asia absorbs the very product that they make, right, so to speak. There is some truth to this, but and hence some truth to Khalid's observation that if you add up the total shipment of the 4 brands is not too far or about the same or even bigger than as far as the Indian ones. So Indian phone makers for Indian market, if you add them up, they are very big, volume-wise. All right. But if you look at the global markets that are what I would call market competitive, then and hence I will argue China is not that market competitive. Okay, and hence the kind of market penetration of these 4 Chinese brands will be much lower. So in other words, you go on the streets of if I look at the UK market, if I look at the US market, if I look at Japan, all right, in many of these big markets outside China, the 4 Chinese brands will find it much harder to penetrate, number one. In other words, in terms of the number of units you saw, vast majority were still traded in China. Yeah, so that shows on the one hand the importance of end market, but on the other hand, a certain protectionism. All right, and that's why when I interviewed Samsung 2-3 months ago in their headquarters, they knew very well that they can never beat the Chinese brands in their home ground. Cannot, not possible. So they focus on premium. For every Samsung phone sold, they want to make 5 times the profits than every Xiaomi traded in China, because Xiaomi phones were cheap. You see what I'm saying? So number of units shipped is only one indicator. Another indicator is the profitability. So many of these brands actually not making money because of that. So I think once we go into those technical details, then the overall picture I will paint is that Apple and Samsung are dominating in the world market, and these Chinese brands have dominated the domestic market to begin with, have also dominated certain, I would argue, lower income countries like African countries, as well as perhaps certain South American markets. India is Indian brands. There are domestic brands as well. Hey. But also Chinese brands, but there are many domestic brands you will never have heard of because it's not for exports. Yeah, I have the technical detail for that. Because for the money we pay to IHS, I have every single mobile phone by model, by brand, and what are the components that went in. Yeah, somebody collected all this data. You just need money, means research grant to buy. So that hopefully addressed some of these issues. So there is shifting end market for sure. But my overall story for this presentation is not to predict which brand will become more successful. Is not really my problem. I mean, you know, I don't need to help them to make money because these are bad guys anyway. But I'm interested in why their economies develop. Yeah, that's my sort of bigger story. Hi.
And then there's 2 more hands up front. Yeah.
Yeung from GDI.
Hi.
I'm interested in if now the role of the state is more to encourage horizontal industrial policy. What is there for countries that were originally institutionally extractive? What remains for them to do?
And you select the other 2.
Can you give maybe just one country example? Like
Any countries in Africa, for instance, apart from Botswana.
Okay, so say African state, yeah.
Countries that are institutionally extractive.
Yeah, I understand, yeah. There, sorry, yeah.
Education and international development. One is that you mentioned that the interviews that you mentioned with all of these players, so I'm very interested in perhaps whether they've spoken to you about the risks that they've received. And if you could comment on what you mentioned a while ago about the fact that iPhones can't be made in America, they have to be made in East Asia, and even sort of very geographical networks. And so there must have been a lot of embedding. And so I'm wondering how nimble those sort of factories are presented as a very physical picture of all of these things. So how nimble are they to, for instance, a disruption in that technology? So if suddenly people don't use mobile phones anymore, I mean,
Is it possible, people?
Well,
you sleep with your phone.
I think that's what they said about
I'm kidding.
Other kinds of technologies.
Okay,
as well.
yeah.
So I think it should be possible to imagine that kind of technological disruption. So I'm just wondering whether you had a sense of how ready these systems were for that.
I get it.
There was another one down here, and then Jamie, and then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where's the next? Oh, there it is.
You know, some African countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda are trying to emulate, South Korea and Taiwan industrialization and Singapore industrialization by taking, the textbook understanding of the developmental state, where the state was, omnipotent, getting prices wrong and dictating the process. So, what would you suggest for this kind of aspiring African countries, especially because now the dynamics have changed as you have shown, to succeed or to catch up in industrialization and without exploiting labor, because now we are doing it by exploiting labor, right? Starting from this labor intensive industries by attracting cheap labor, but without
exploiting labor, and Jamie last. I'm writing, so my head has been done. Yes.
My third year Asian labor geography classes, when we start the semester, we talk about how labor isn't simply a passive factor of production, but itself is an important part of the story of East Asian development. So I know it's not the topic of your talk, but I don't know if you could hazard a few words on things like labor control regimes or factory regimes and the role that they might play in your story, either in the developmental period or its this more recent period of more globally expansive coupling process.
Okay. Right. Okay. Maybe I think I will combine the Gido's question with the question about Africa without exploiting labor. These are related, yeah. So essentially about the role of the state, right? Sort of the shift from extractive industries, in particularly the primary resources industries, to more kind of a manufacturing-oriented kind of industrialization. That would be the ideal solution, isn't it? So first answer is difficult. It's not going to be easy. Because why? The examples I'm talking about here, South Korea, Taiwan, did it before China opened up. In fact, made good use of China when China was opening up, right? To the extent that today, the biggest notebook manufacturers, all the names you know of, the factories are in China, but Taiwanese owned, right? So Taiwan benefited from China, South Korea benefited from China, now benefit from Vietnam, So, but now if I were to think of African states, to sort of try to have this kind of shift of manufacturing industries, it's going to be very difficult. So in that sense, I'm not even thinking of whether labor to be, the point is, even if labor is willing to be exploited, you still may not get a chance to be even exploited, because it's very difficult now to think of unpacking, unbundling these production networks and shift at a sort of, in this case, intercontinental scale. Within Asia, as I mentioned earlier a little bit, Samsung managed to shift from China largely before 2009, about 2010, to Vietnam. That's doable, but because Samsung was able to exploit Vietnam's deal to be the player. So Vietnam gave a lot of deal to Samsung, and Vietnam had quite large young labor force as well, right? So your argument, I mean, your wish that to have this kind of industrialization without exploiting labor is, I don't know. I mean, personally, I'm not labor expert, but I think it's probably not possible, because you almost always start with labor intensive part, the final assembly part of the operation. You can't start with chip making. Not possible. Means semiconductors, for example. Remember, in the typical, all of these devices, the more value-added stuff will be the intermediate goods, not the final assembly, right? But you will always get the final assembly part first because it's more labor intensive. Now, I haven't even brought in the robotics, the AI stuff, artificial intelligence stuff, yeah? Because Foxconn factories are going to be less labor intensive, are going to be more robotized, all right? I even interviewed a company that make the robot for Foxconn to assemble your iPhone, the little fingers, that the human fingers to be replaced. And a company, you won't believe it, is your printer company called Epson. Epson, you know, Epson, the printer? They make the small robot that are as nimble as the young female workers, all right? They are programmable, that probably, you know, Jamie will not complain. I mean, complain for the good reason, right reason. I mean, labor control, I understand. So I'm sorry, I really have no easy solution out currently. I mean, partly because to me, this industry, at least electronics, is ultra competitive, and hence go back subsequently to the disruptive risk question from somewhere there. That's why. So for development purpose, it's very, very tricky. So I can't give easy solution. Yeah, but I know the African states are very into developmental state, because I know Peter Evans and others have come up with some new this is called developmental state. I know what's it called, post-developmental state, whatever. Some new idea of the kind of absorptive capacity of the state. So, but I think to be fair, the state capacity has to be built up. But whether industrialization of the sort we are looking at will take place, I really cannot guarantee today. But you know, if you think of South Korea and Taiwan, even Singapore, I mean, we went through pretty tough political regimes in its time. Authoritarianism, dictatorship took place. You know what I mean? South Korea, until the Park Chung-hee himself got killed by his #1 security chief, right? So, and his daughter, as you know, recently thrown into the jail, who was the former president, yeah? Risk. And then I come back to Jamie's labor question. Risk, nimbleness of factories. Okay, so this question is more related to the current research that I'm doing than the research that went into the book, which took place in the past 10 years. You know, academics are slow, yeah? So current research that I do, when I interview many of these global lead firms, yes, there is a major concern with supply chain disruption and hence risk, yeah? So, the risk factor has been factored in terms of sourcing decisions and choices. But even so, there are still certain kind of components that are made and dominated by only one suppliers. And hence the risk factor in global production networks in the electronics industry is very high. If Mr. Kim from the north, as we are talking right now, press a button and shoot to South Korea, I can tell you, for the next 2 years, everybody forget about, or means keep your iPhone and Samsung now. Because for the next 2 years, there will not be smartphones, computers, because memory chips are gone. You know, Samsung, many things Samsung dominate in the industry. So no new display, no TV, all gone. You just don't have. Don't watch the World Cup. Premier League, you go to the stadium. Don't watch the TV because the TV doesn't work anymore. So in that sense, this kind of heavy regional domination of at least the electronics industry is high risk. All right. I mean, I have no easy solution because these firms are under severe competitive pressure to compete. So, and hence it's very hard for them to sort of diversify for the sake of risk minimization, because there is an optimality that has to be achieved between diversification of location in order to achieve risk management vis-a-vis cost minimization, right? The more diversified you are, the more costly, because you can't optimize in one location. You see what I'm saying? So in that sense, I think all of these firms recognize this, particularly those firms that outsource most. Yeah. So Apple actually experienced very high risk in that sense, because if Foxconn, Shenzhen and Foxconn Zhengzhou give big trouble, then goodbye, people. I mean, you don't have your new iPhone 9 now. Labor question, perennial, forever, right? I mean, as we know. Now, again, I'm at what? The center of industrial revolution, isn't it? Now, if there was no Manchester, is it fair to say if there was no Manchester Industrial Revolution, Peter, that there might not be Karl Marx? Or maybe there was Karl Marx, but won't be the Marx we know of, because there was no bad exploitation in his time that Marx saw, couldn't take it, and wrote about it, right? I mean, this is my speculation. I'm not historian of, you know. political thought. But I mean, by and large, my argument here is that from then, the Manchester then, to the Foxconn today, we still see, if you like, the incessant exploitation of labor throughout the world, isn't it? Now, I grew up communist China in Guangzhou when I was born, right? So if I think of the days when I was in China, yeah, there was maybe no exploitation of labor because all were the same. So I don't know whether there is exploitation in this time. But the point I want to make is that I really can't tell. But in terms of the labor control regime that enables certain capitalist circulation of production, faster, slower, and whatsoever, I will say because we tend to focus on the Foxconn example, which actually is only one part of the very small part of the East Asian story. Because the kind of examples I'm focusing now a lot more on are the higher value activities. So if you look at the, say, ODMs, right, the guys who design the computers in Taiwan. So yes, the final assembly may be quite heavy labor exploiting, but the design and many of the activities that go into Acer, that go into Vistrom in Taiwan, tend to be reasonable pay, good working condition. Yeah, many of the semiconductor firms we went have very, very good working conditions because they are very conscientious of CSR, and so on and so forth. But the final assembly factories could be problematic. But then because we tend to focus on the final assembly factory, but we forgot 95% of the value out of which maybe half are located in Asia. And that part of the story, if we bring it out, I think it's a better balance. But I do agree that the 5% value capture in the final assembly tends to be where labor exploitation is at the highest. So, and that is no different from when Foxconn goes to Wisconsin. And let's see how the American workers can survive it. I doubt they will even want to work there, all right? So I don't know what will happen. I mean, that is an internal story. So, yeah.
Thank you, Henry. I think our time is pretty much up, so I just would like to thank Henry again for a really fascinating, stimulating lecture.
Thank you. Yeah.